The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Spectators filled the gallery, eager to witness what would unfold. Journalists sat with their notepads ready, cameras flashing outside the courthouse. This wasn't just any trial. It was a high-profile case with millions of dollars at stake. At the center of it all stood a man known for his sharp tongue and ruthless tactics. The defense attorney, Mark Harrington, was feared in legal circles. His reputation? Destroy the opposition. He had won countless cases by breaking witnesses apart, turning their words against them. He never held back. Today, his target was Bill Gates. The billionaire wasn't on trial, but he had been called to testify. As a key witness, his words could shift the case's direction. Mark Harrington wasn't impressed. In fact, he was amused. A tech billionaire sitting in his courtroom? Easy target. He didn't care how much money Gates had. Here, in this space, Mark was king. He smirked as he glanced at his legal team. "Watch this," he muttered. The judge entered. "All rise." Everyone stood, but Harrington barely acknowledged the moment. His confidence radiated as he prepared to take control. He was about to do what he did best: mock, humiliate, and win. Mark Harrington sat confidently at the defense table, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood. He had spent years perfecting his craft, twisting words, setting traps, and making fools out of people. And today would be no different. His client, a powerful tech company, was facing a lawsuit over unfair business practices. The plaintiff? A small but ambitious startup that claimed it had been crushed under corporate pressure. They accused Harrington's client of using unethical methods to drive them out of the market. The stakes were high, but Harrington wasn't worried. He had built his defense around one thing: discrediting witnesses. If he could make the plaintiff's key figures look unreliable, the case would crumble. And who better to target than Bill Gates himself? Harrington saw Gates as an easy opponent. The billionaire wasn't a lawyer, after all. He wasn't used to hostile questioning, legal tricks, or courtroom battles. "I'll make him look like a clueless businessman," Harrington thought. "I'll turn him into a joke." His strategy was simple. Mock Gates' credibility, suggest that billionaires like him don't understand real-world struggles. Twist his words, make it seem like he was dodging questions, use sarcasm and condescension, throw Gates off balance and make him uncomfortable. Harrington had done this hundreds of times. He was sure it would work today, too. The judge called Gates to the stand. Harrington adjusted his tie, smirked slightly, and leaned forward. It was time to humiliate Bill Gates. Bill Gates took the stand, adjusting his glasses. He looked calm, composed, completely unfazed by the courtroom tension. Mark Harrington, sitting at his table, studied him for a moment. Then, with a smirk, he stood up. Time to begin. He approached the witness stand slowly, hands in his pockets. His voice was smooth, calculated. "Mr. Gates, thank you for gracing us with your presence today. I imagine a man of your wealth and influence doesn't usually have time for matters like these." A few chuckles echoed in the courtroom. Harrington smiled. He loved controlling the mood. Gates didn't flinch. "I believe justice is worth making time for." Harrington tilted his head slightly. "Of course, justice, right?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. He pulled out a sheet of paper, flipping through it dramatically. "Now, Mr. Gates, just so we're clear, you have no formal legal education, correct?" Gates nodded. "That's correct." Harrington grinned. "Right. So you're not a lawyer. You don't spend your time studying the law, practicing in courtrooms, or understanding the finer details of litigation. But today, you're here, giving legal testimony. Interesting." He turned to the jury, as if to say, "See what I mean?" Gates remained steady. "I'm here as a witness to provide factual information." Harrington chuckled. "Ah, factual information, that's good." He strolled back toward his desk, pausing. "Tell me, Mr. Gates, how many courtrooms have you testified in?" Gates thought for a second. "A few over the years." "A few," Harrington repeated, shaking his head. "Not exactly an expert witness, then." The jury watched as the lawyer paced back and forth. He was enjoying himself. "Mr. Gates," Harrington continued, "you're a businessman, a very rich businessman, but do you really expect this court to believe that you, someone who deals in billions, understand the struggles of small businesses?" His voice grew sharper. "How can someone like you, with unlimited resources, possibly relate to a company fighting to survive?" Harrington leaned in slightly, waiting for Gates to fumble. But Gates didn't. He looked at Harrington, calm as ever. I started in a garage, with no money, so yes, I can relate. Silence. For the first time, Harrington hesitated. The courtroom fell into a brief silence. Harrington's smirk wavered for just a second. He hadn't expected that answer. A garage? No money? That wasn't the response he wanted. He needed Gates to look out of touch, not relatable. Regaining his composure, he forced a chuckle. Ah yes, the famous Microsoft garage story, a true underdog tale. His voice was dripping with sarcasm. Gates didn't react. He simply waited, calm, collected, unshaken. Harrington cleared his throat and pressed forward. All right, Mr. Gates, let's talk about competition. He glanced at the jury. Your company, Microsoft, has been accused many times of crushing smaller businesses, hasn't it? Gates nodded. There have been cases, yes. And Microsoft has faced lawsuits over monopolistic practices, correct? Another nod. That's true, Harrington smiled. This was it, his moment. Then tell me, he said, stepping closer to the stand, why should this jury believe that you, a man whose company has been accused of harming small businesses, actually care about fairness? The jury turned their eyes to Gates. The tension was thick. Gates didn't blink. No anger. No frustration. Just logic. I believe in innovation, he said simply. Some companies succeed because they build something great. Others fail because they can't keep up. That's not unfair, that's business. A few heads in the jury nodded slightly. Harrington noticed he needed to change tactics. So, you're saying competition is fair game? Gates shrugged. If the rules are followed, yes. Harrington scoffed. But if you were the underdog in this case, if you were the small business, would you still feel that way? Gates paused. Then with a small smile he said, I was the underdog. That's how I built Microsoft. Another silence. The jury was listening. And worse for Harrington. They were believing. Harrington's jaw tightened. He was losing control. Harrington's grip on the case was slipping, and he knew it. His usual tactics weren't working. The jury wasn't laughing at Gates. They weren't rolling their eyes. They were listening to him. That was dangerous. He needed to turn this around, fast. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his tie and forced a smirk. All right, Mr. Gates, let's forget business for a moment. Let's talk about something simple. Something we can all understand. He turned to the jury, gesturing dramatically. Imagine this. You walk into a restaurant, you order a meal, you expect fair service, correct? Some jury members nodded. Harrington turned back to Gates. But what if the restaurant owner sees you, recognizes you as a billionaire, and decides to charge you 10 times the price? Would that be fair? Gates didn't hesitate. If the price was clearly listed and I agreed to it, then yes. Harrington blinked. He hadn't expected such a quick, logical response. He tried again, but what if they didn't tell you? What if they tricked you into paying more? Gates tilted his head slightly. Then it would be fraud. And there are laws against that. The jury nodded again. Harrington could feel the case slipping through his fingers. His face flushed slightly, but he pushed forward. Let's say, he said, his voice sharpening, that this restaurant owner also controls all the other restaurants in town. And suddenly, nobody else can serve food. Would that be fair? Gates' expression didn't change. If they achieved that by offering the best service and customers chose them? Yes. The answer was too perfect, too unshakable. Harrington clenched his jaw. He was running out of tricks. Desperate to regain control, he decided to go for the big move. The one that would humiliate Gates and turn the jury against him. He took a slow step forward, his voice dropping lower. Mr. Gates, he said, do you believe that you are the smartest person in this room? The question hung in the air. The jury leaned in. And then Bill Gates smiled. Bill Gates smiled. It wasn't smug, it wasn't arrogant. It was the smile of a man who had just won a game his opponent didn't realize was over. Harrington felt a flicker of doubt. That wasn't the reaction he wanted. He expected hesitation, maybe a nervous chuckle. Instead, Gates looked amused. Then Gates answered. I don't need to be the smartest person in the room, he said. I just need to be the one who listens. Silence. The jury was hooked. Harrington's confidence cracked. He was losing control. Badly. Then it happened. Out of pure instinct, he glanced at the jury box, and for the first time that day, his stomach dropped. Sitting in the jury was a face he recognized, a face that should not have been there. His breath caught in his throat, his palms went clammy. Paul Reynolds. A former tech executive, a man who had worked in the industry for decades, someone who knew Bill Gates personally, More importantly, someone who knew exactly who Mark Harrington was. Harrington had gone up against Reynolds' company years ago in a brutal legal battle. And he had won. But he hadn't won fairly. He had used every dirty trick in the book, twisted words, manipulated evidence, painted Reynolds as incompetent in front of a jury, just like he had been trying to do to Gates. And now, Reynolds was on the jury. Watching. Remembering. Harrington's throat went dry. Gates, still calm, followed his gaze. Then, just barely, he smirked. Harrington's confidence shattered. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. Mark Harrington's confidence was gone. His signature smirk had vanished. He could feel the weight of Paul Reynolds' gaze from the jury box. A man who knew exactly what kind of lawyer he was. A man who had been his victim once. And now? That man had the power to decide his fate. The courtroom had shifted. The energy had changed. For the first time in his career, Harrington felt small. His once powerful voice now sounded weak. No further questions, Your Honor." Whispers spread through the gallery. People weren't used to seeing Mark Harrington retreat. The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Very well. The witness may step down." Bill Gates stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked back to his seat without a word. No need for a victory speech. He had already won. The jury had seen everything. They had watched Harrington's arrogance crumble. They had seen Gates handle himself with composure, intelligence, and dignity. Most importantly, they had seen Harrington break. As Gates sat down, he allowed himself one final glance toward the jury box. Paul Reynolds nodded ever so slightly. The message was clear. Harrington had spent his entire career mocking, humiliating, and controlling others. But today, he had mocked the wrong man, and he had lost.